Yes, continue, Marshall.
So, given a brief introduction altogether, learning theory of personality presents a model of personality that emphasizes observable behavior. Uh, they do not give importance to the internal cause of behavior, most of the behaviorists actually. Personality, like other learned behavior, is acquired through classical and operant conditioning or observational learning, reinforcement, extinction, generalization, as well as discrimination. Children can learn things like kindness, hostility, generosity, or destructiveness. Here we are going to talk about the Pavlov's theory of learning and Skinner's theory of personality. To start up with, Pavlov, just a small introduction about himself. So Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, 1814 to 1936, he is basically from Russia. He basically attended the religious school and a seminary there, where he studied natural sciences. He pursued himself to study further in the natural science. He went to the Military Medical Academy in 1875 and thereby doctorate in 1883. Went to Germany and where he studied in Leipzig with Carl Ludwig, all sort of history which we could run through it. But some significant is that he has been worked in the laboratories, 3 laboratories at the time. So Department of Pharmacology is where in the Military Medical Academy he worked in. So I was talking about the 3 laboratories are those Institute of Physiology of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, which is now named after him, the Institute of Experimental Medicine, and Biological Laboratory at Koltoshi near St. Petersburg. He established fistulas from various parts of the digestive tract when he was experimenting over a dog or an animal, I would say. Digestive tract by which he obtained secretion of the salivary glands, pancreas, and liver without disturbing nerve and blood supply. Pavlov was a behaviorist. Observable behavior can be measured and thought cannot. So he is very clear onto that, saying like behavior can be measured and thought cannot be. Scientific evidence is the keyword in his theory. Pavlov studied about the reflexes. Some reflexes such as blinking our eyes when an puff of air comes on it, or sucking of a baby when something input in our mouth. This automatic behavior can be manipulated. This is called the conditioning. Conditioning has been defined as a form of learning in which capacity of eliciting a response is transferred from one stimulus to another. This stimulus calls as a reflex on its own. In order to explain Pavlov's learning theory of personality, first we will focus our attention on the process and principles of classical conditioning and see how this process and principles are found to be helpful in the development and change of personality. So he explains it with one of the process. It's a very systematic way of performing this particular task, which he has done it on an basically on a dog. So Pavlov first performed a simple operation on his dog in which a rubber tube was inserted into his salivary gland, so that the precise amount of saliva secreted during the experiment could be measured. After making these initial preparations, a neutral stimulus, we call a conditioned stimulus is somewhat is it goes in one particular timeline without miss. That means it cannot be eliminated. So that's called conditional stimuli. In here, in this research, in this laboratory, we named this conditional stimuli as bell. Was presented for a brief period of time, followed quickly by a second stimulus known to elicit salivation response and called unconditional stimulus, example meat powder. So each pairing of conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus served as conditioning trials, and a number of such pairings were conducted in rapid succession. As a result of repeating pairing this conditioning stimuli, in this example a bell, acquire the ability to evoke the salivation. Because the salivation to the bell began to occur only after the conditioning, it was termed conditioned response On the other hand, the salivation response to the meat powder, which seems to occur automatically, was termed unconditioned response. So here are these smaller of this pictorial representation. So everybody must have heard about Pavlov. We have seen in a couple of examples also. So what he does basically, he uh, just rings the bell and keeps the meat, and then rings the bell, keeps the meat powder. Now this time he rings the bell after so many repetitive tasks. He rings the bell, and automatically saliva comes in the mouth of dog. And even if you are by keeping the what you call the meat powder, again the saliva continues to elicit. So now if we even if he doesn't keep the meat powder, with the ring of a bell next time, automatically saliva still comes in. So that's what he was explaining altogether in this particular way. In this experiment, the first order conditioning, food was removed from the situation. What if we remove this food? What happens? And a new stimulus, example light, we can even show a light onto that instead of food if paired with bell. This new stimulus light also acquired the property of eliciting the response. So Risk-Korla suggested that under appropriate circumstances, even third order conditioning can be established. There is few of the principles in classical conditioning. Our Pavlov focus on some of the important principles on three, which governs three aspects of it: acquisition, generalization and discrimination, extinction and spontaneous recovery. There are two factors which exert strong influence upon the ability of a conditioned stimulus to elicit a response. First is the number of pairings between the stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, meaning how many times you put the bell and a food, bell and a food, and a bell and a food meat. As the number of pairing increases, the conditioned stimulus comes to evoke a conditioned response with increased strength. So more you elicited the continuity, more the response would be stronger. That's what they say. The strength of the response is measured in terms of magnitude, latency, and probability of occurrence of the conditioned response. Now, the other particular influencing factor is on the second factor, which exerts an important effect upon the process of classical conditioning, is the interval, which elapses between the presentation of conditioned stimulus and unconditional stimulus. For many different responses, conditioning appears to be maximal, where there is interval is 0.5 seconds. However, further research suggests that in some cases it can much longer and still produce conditioning. So here we are talking about the interval between the first conditional stimuli and the second unconditional stimuli, the pairing part of it. Within how many months interval, how many minutes or seconds of interval you show the second stimuli part of it. So Garcia McGowan in her experiment along with the green, rats were given a sweet tasting liquid to drink, and where they injected with a drug which makes them sick in the stomach. The rats were found to acquire an aversion to the taste, even when the interval between the drinking and nausea was more than an hour. Marilyn Stigma noted that humans too learn strong aversion to the taste of foods, which makes them sick many hours after they have eaten. The acquisition of irrational fears of phobias, sexual hang-up fetish, prejudice, and hostile feelings has successfully been explained through the process of classical conditioning. In both the cases, stimuli initially incapable of eliciting strong reaction acquire this ability through repeated pairing with unconditional stimuli. So hope it is self-explanatory. Just because rat has got a stomach pain, it presumes it because of having that sweet tasting drink. So next time when you keep it, and it takes longer time, or sometimes it even ignores it to have that. So it's because we are very much receptive towards the negative reinforcements altogether. For example, a child while playing a new pet suddenly hears a loud sound of a backfiring truck. In all probability, the noise, which may be viewed as an unconditional stimulus, will frighten the child greatly. So next time, if there is any loud, when next time again, when a child is playing with a pet, and again when you get a big sound altogether, with a truck or something, any accident. So it tends to show as the rhythm or as the overall frequency that he shouldn't play with the pet and something will happen. So that's how the assumptions will go on together, which influences the behavior. Similarly, sexual hang-up can also be explained through the process of classical conditioning. Assume that a person for whom an article of clothing is initially nothing to do with a sexual arousal. So now imagine that a man sees the nude body of his lover along with that clothing article, and it happens to take place repeatedly. Now, what will happen? The sexual arousal, which is a natural response to the nude body of the lover, will be associated with that article of cloth. In the same way, development of prejudice and hostility can also be accounted by the process of classical conditioning. This is self-explanatory. I can explain furthermore offline about this particular example on the sexual arousal. Moving towards a generalization, once the organism is conditioned to one stimulus, it is often found that it will be responded to other stimuli. Stimulus generations plays a very important adaptive role. For example, the sound made by angry bees, wasps, or hornets are highly similar, but certainly not identical. Because of stimulus generalization, however, an individual who has learned through painful experiences to react with the fear and caution to one of the sound may also respond in a similar manner to others as well. Very classic example is that you get to hear the voice of your wife shouting at it altogether. When you go to any of your relatives' place, when you happen to hear the similar kind of sound and you immediately react to it saying, like presuming that it is your own wife who is shouting at it. That's the generalization with a crude example I gave it. Opposite to this phenomenon is stimulus discrimination within the framework of classical conditioning. Although the ability of human beings and other organisms to discriminate between various objects is quite impressive, but it has some limits. The disconcerting effects may result when these limits are exceeded is suggested by experiments dealing with the phenomenon of experimental neurosis. Let's see what is experimental neurosis is explained in the context of discrimination. In famous experiment by Schenker Krustovlia, a circle was used by a conditioned stimulus before feeding, meaning there's a circle and there is an ellipse. So ellipse is not a circle, it is almost like a curve that tells about the overall circle. And the dog was also trained to associate an ellipse with not being fed. By small steps, the ellipse was then made more and more like a circle. When the ellipse was almost round, initially the dog could usually extinguish it from a circle. But after a few weeks, the dog became neurotic. It ceased to be able to recognize obvious ellipses and circle, became very excited and was no longer calm during experiments. So Pavlov termed the animal's abnormal condition as experimental neurosis. It's basically mental illness, inertia, or kind of an restlessness. And he attributed it to the disturbance of the balance between excitatory and inhibitory processes in the nervous system. These experiments on experimental neurosis show that dogs with the different personalities were differentially susceptible to the treatment. The same treatment on different dogs could produce quite a different neurosis. Experiments, the result of such experiments, however, suggests that while the ability of human beings to discriminate between stimuli is impressive, their ability to discriminate between highly similar stimuli has definite limits. When the environmental conditions require that these limits be exceeded, extreme stress may be induced. Moving towards the extinction, when a conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented, but is never followed by the unconditioned stimulus. For example, you ring a bell and you don't keep a meat. For first 3 times you kept the meat, saliva comes in. 4th time, again, you are not giving the meat. 5th time, you are not giving the meat. 6th time, you are not giving the meat, though you are ringing the bell. So what happens automatically? The particular behavior pattern has been extincted. That's what it says altogether. And it fades away completely. This phenomenon is called an extinction. But if the same extinguished stimulus is then presented against at a later time, the capacity to evoke the response is found to reappear. But at the same time, again, you ring a bell, sometimes you suddenly all of a sudden put a meat altogether, it automatically salivates because it has a capacity to get adaptable to the previous phenomenon, the sequence what the particular dog has undergone, dog or any of the behavior undergone. Extinction of a conditioned response. So basically this extension, once we recover with that particular way of getting back into the response by salivating. Mr. Paolo mentioned it as a spontaneous recovery. Extension of conditioned response is also very important for the development of normal personality. If we lack some mechanism for getting rid of useless reactions to stimuli, which no longer serve as a reliable cues for the occurrence of such events, we would become a walking bundle of useless conditioned responses. So this extension is really important. It can be used in terms of an removing of addictions, all those aspects of it. We'll read in detail in the Skinner's level 2. Principles of behavior modification. So treatment of neurosis and phobias, it helps very much in terms of behavior modification, as we had discussed about the addiction part. Rather than focusing on the root of the problem like a traditional psychopathologist, a behaviorist could focus on eliminating the symptoms by bringing classical conditioning into play by reinforcing the extinction of the symptom. We spoke about in many of the situations, is this habit due to genetically continued, or is that is hereditary, or is that is something to do with the child's behavior in the previous, in his childhood level, or whatever the habit that has been generated so far. But this particular Pavlov's behavioral theory tells very clearly on the by conditioning part alone, we can able to eliminate certain symptoms by bringing the classical conditioning into play. By reinforcing the extinction of the symptom, the psychopathological illness of the patient could be eliminated. That's what he's trying to explain. For example, therapeutic technique known as flooding, principles of extinction, systematic desensitization is still another important technique successfully in dealing with a wide range of maladaptive behaviors, including examination, anxiety, phobias, nightmares, stuttering, depression, obsession, impotence, and anorexia nervosa based on the principles of extinction. So it's again anorexia nervosa. It's again a kind of an it's a kind of a mental illness only. Process of behavior modification. What is the process that usually happens in this particular situation? The process of classical conditioning was also found useful for treating alcoholism and nicotine addiction. According to a principle of Pavlov, both the pleasurable physiological effects of nicotine and alcohol uncondition the stimuli, and the taste of nicotine and alcohol as conditioned stimuli. When one stops ingesting the substance, as in traditional treatment procedures, it is extremely easy to become an addicted again. So though in this particular scenario, there is two things are there. Pleasure is one thing, and then what you consume is the second stimuli. So what they are trying to say, it can go on an extension that can still be only on a temporary situation. So as in a traditional treatment procedures, it is extremely easy to become addicted again. After all, simply not presenting a conditional stimulus does not eliminate the relationship between and the unconditional stimulus. So we spoke about the extinction. We also spoke about phenomenon of recovery. So it's very simple, like an individual, as when we could able to adapt the same behavior which we had tried earlier, though there is a gap because our brain connects to the previous behavior. Similar way, the particular pleasure during the alcohol or during the addiction of smoke or no, when there is a situation comes back in terms of a smoke or a small gist of it or hint that comes into the mind, instinctively it goes back and tend to get into that addiction once again. So for which there's another reason what they are talking about, like when we spoke about the rat consuming the sweet taste of drink and then injected by the drug which creates a nausea. That's a similar example they give for that addiction here. What they say, with just one use, the taste and unconditioned pleasurable effects become associated with each other again, as we spoke, correct? If the taste of nicotine or alcohol, the conditioned response is paired with a new unpleasant effect, such as nausea and vomiting, the result will be negative, aversion to the substances in question. Such was the case when both an old alcoholic man and a young chain-smoking adolescent were given apomorphine paired with an alcohol and nicotine, respectively. The drug apomorphine induces several feelings of nausea and vomiting, which causes both of them to give up their addictive substances for life. This process is called counter conditioning and has had remarkably success in curing addictions in curing the addictions. And the therapy based on the principles of counter conditioning is termed as an aversion therapy, which we will learn in the coming process. I will take up the questions if you have anything, or else I can move to the next one. It's about P.F. Skinner.
Clear for me so far.
Yes, Umashankar, go ahead.
All right. Our friend is a small introduction about B.F. Skinner, born in 1904, and he left us in August, I believe, in 1990. Yes, and he did in BA in English, Hamilton. To catch some of the key interesting thing, he is an atheist. I don't know why they have mentioned. He has done his master in psychology in 1930, and his doctorate in 1931. He had two daughters after his marriage, so he used one of the daughter as one of the Skinner's inventions. So we will get into the depth of research sometime later, which is not part of our term now. He has died because of leukemia. Perhaps most later that he became most celebrated psychologist since Sigmund Freud. It emerged from the works carried out in a laboratory settings. Even he also feels like any other learning theories of personality, Skinner's theory did not grow out of the therapeutic situations. Rather, it emerged from the works carried out in the laboratory way. The study of individual subjects in a most controlled condition. He focused on the study of individual subjects instead of generalized group, which reflects his belief that lawful control can be seen in individual behavior. While other personality theorists attempted to understand personality by studying groups, Skinner attempted to develop general laws by studying individual. Particular aspects of human nature like determinism, elementalism, changeability, objectivity, reactivity, and knowability, while rejected the other aspects like rationality, irrationality, and homeostasis and heterostasis completely, because he did not consider the internal source of human behavior important for explaining the behavior itself. So the path what Skinner has chosen is similar to the Pavlov's, to mention it. So according to Skinner, study of personality can be done on the basis of systematic and precise evaluation of individuals' genetic and idiosyncratic learning history. It means that for studying the personality, one has to study and discover the relationship between the behavior of the organism and its reinforcing consequences. Skinner's theory is based on the assumptions that behavior is lawful, it can be predicted, and it can be controlled. Lawful, it can be predicted, and it can be controlled. So it is explained in the following things. One, we talk about first one is an operant behavior. So here he stated distinguished in two types, respondent and operant. Respondent behaviors are those which are elicited by the stimuli of the environment that are well known and can be identified easily. These behaviors are involuntary and automatic in the sense that if the stimuli is presented before the organism, the behavior related to the stimuli will occur automatically. The organism has no control over it. Constrictions of pupil, when if there is any dust about to fall in, you tend to close up your pupil. Salivation, sweating, etc. Some of these these behaviors are usually not learned by the organism at simply level, but at complex level. So wherein the operant behaviors, on the other hand, those behaviors which are not caused by any stimuli of the environment. The stimuli of the operant behavior are difficult to identify. These behaviors are performed by the individual voluntarily. Skinner was one of the opinion that behaviors of human beings are predominantly operant in nature. The peculiarity of this class of response gives rise to Skinner's use of the term operant. An operant is a response that operates in the environment and changes it. The changes in the environment affect the subsequent occurrence of the response. In operant conditioning, therefore, reinforcer is not associated with an eliciting stimulus. Instead, it is associated with the response. Now we are going to talk about the operant behavior. How does he explain within one of the lab tests? So he used what's so called a special cage called Skinner box that has a bar or a lever on one wall that when pressed causes a little mechanism to release a full pellet. So hope you could see the screen very clearly where the food pellet is and where the liver is. The rat, whichever is about to touch, is called the liver. The rat is bouncing around the cage, doing whatever the rats do. When he accidentally presses the liver, so in operant conditioning, it is essential that the reinforcer be presented after the occurrence of the response. A reinforcer is defined as anything that strengthens the tendency to behave in particular way. Food satisfies hunger, so you eat. Money reinforces the likelihood that you will keep working. A child will behave well over time because mom and dad approve him. In other words, reinforcement is a stimulus. Here the reinforcer is the food, which if it appears in the proper temporal relation with a response, tends to maintain or to increase the strength of a response. Reinforcement may either be positive or negative. The likelihood of the behavior will be increased by the positive reinforcement, adding something pleasant, and also by the negative reinforcement, turning off, removing something unpleasant. We all spoke about the carrot and stick, it's similar to that approach. Skinner's entire system is based on operant conditioning, process of operant conditions given below. A rat is moving around the cage and accidentally it presses the lever and a food pellet falls into the cage. The operant is who the presses the lever, is the behavior just prior to the reinforcer, which is the food pellet, of course. In no time at all, the rat is furiously pedaling away at the lever, holding his pile of pellets in the corner of the cage. The behavior followed by the reinforcing stimulus results in an increased probability of that behavior occurring in the future. So every time once he started feeling that how it works altogether, by pressing the lever, I get my food pellet. So it tends to repeat the frequency as and when it is required. What if you do not give the rat any more pellets? Apparently, after a few futile attempts, he stops his lever pressing behavior. Correct. This is called extinction, as we read in the previous Pavlov's 2. A behavior no longer followed by the reinforcing stimulus results in a decreased probability of that behavior occurring in the future. Now, again, we spoke about spontaneous recovery. If you were turned the pellet machine back on so that pressing the lever again provides the rat with pellets, the behavior of lever pressing will return right back into existence much more quickly than it took for the rat to learn the behavior at the first time. So now, second time when you're trying to do it, it need not wait and see and then try it out, because it's already undergone the scenario of how it works. So immediately it gets back to that particular intelligence, and so we call it as spontaneous recovery. We are moving towards something called schedules of reinforcement. It tells about the ratios and the interval time period between the reinforcer and the operand. Skinner decided to reduce the number of reinforcements he gave his rats for whatever behavior he was trying to condition, and observed that the rats kept up their operant behaviors at a stable rate, no less. This is how Skinner discovered schedules of reinforcement. Following are the schedules. One is continuous reinforcement. In continuous reinforcement schedule, every time that the rat does the behavior, such as pushing the lever, you get the food. Very simple. Every time you touch the lever, every time you get the food. That is conditional reinforcement. Very clear. Now, intermittent reinforcement is that, again, classified into two: fixed ratio and the fixed interval. This schedule is what the rat does not get the reinforcement every time he presses the lever. So we are fluctuating it through these particular two parameters. Fixed ratio schedule was the first one Skinner discovered. If the rat presses the lever 3 times, say he gets reinforcement, or 5 times, or 20 times, or multiple times. So how it tells about the ratio, number of times if you press and you get it. That's how you define the behavior. Another part of it is the fixed interval schedule uses a timing device of some sort. If the rat presses the lever at least once during a particular stretch of time, say 20 seconds, then he gets reinforcement. If he fails to do so, he does not get it. Even if he presses the bar 100 times during that 20 seconds, he still only gets only one reinforcement. So what does it say? After 20 seconds, you get the food, whether you press 1 time or 100 times. Here we tell about the interval time period when you are giving the reinforcement. Skinner also looked at variable ratios and variable schedules. Variable ratio means you change the X each time. First, it takes 3 presses to get the food, then 10, and then 1, then 7, and so on. So it's something like there is no any fixed time period. Now we are reading the behavior in a multiple variable time slots period, ratios type thing. The seconds may vary, but still it is completely spontaneous now. What will be the reaction? But still, it can still pedal it to try for again and again. That's what it says. Now, on the other hand, with the variable interval schedule, there is no longer pace themselves because they can no longer establish a rhythm between behavior and reward. Most importantly, these schedules are very resistant to extinction. Of course, when you don't have the very clear fixed way of intervals, you cannot understand the pattern, and so we won't be tempted to try it out, the liver part of it. Third part is that is about aversive stimuli. A behavior followed by an aversive stimulus results in a decreased probability of the behavior occurring in the future. This conditioning known as punishment. If you shock a rat for making a response, the rat will stop to make the response. If you spank the baby for throwing his toys, he will throw his toys less and less. On the other hand, if you remove an already active aversive stimulus after a rat or baby performs a certain behavior, you are doing negative reinforcement. If you turn off the electricity when the rat stands on his hind legs, he will do a lot more standing, meaning you switch on the current. But whenever the rat stands, you tend to switch off the, automatically it switches off the current. So what happens? You are making the rat to stand for more. This is one of the example. Skinner, to some stereotypes that has arisen about behaviorists, does not approve of the use of aversive stimuli. It is not because of ethics, but because they do not work well. He has explained it very clearly. That's because whatever was reinforcing the bad behaviors has not been removed. For example, spanking a baby when he's throwing out the toys. And now, when a baby sees that you are out of the room or you went somewhere else, it tend to throw the toy once again. So it is more like the particular behavior has not been removed. It's been temporarily been controlled. That's what the discussion of the aversive stimuli tells about in this page. Whatever was reinforcing the bad behavior has not been removed as it would have been in the case of extinction. This hidden reinforcer has just been covered up with a conflictive aversive stimulus. In fact, because the baby now only gets to enjoy its reinforcers occasionally, the baby has gone into variable schedule of reinforcement, and it will be even more resistant to extinction than ever. Talking about secondary reinforcements, Skinner box at the time of delivering reinforcement, a sound of click is also produced repeatedly each time. It was found that this click of sound itself acquires the reinforcing characteristics being associated with the original reinforcer. The sound of click is now called secondary reinforcer, meaning whenever at the time of delivering the reinforcement, whenever you put a food, when you are about to deliver the food, when you presses lever, whenever you are about to release the food pellet and it creates a sound, that's a second reinforcer is saying it. Skinner believed that condition or secondary reinforcers are of a great importance in controlling the human behavior. It is possible to reason that much of our behaviors relies on secondary reinforcement. The most common example of secondary reinforcer is money. It has no intrinsic value of its own, but being paired with a number of different unconditioned primary reinforcers, it has itself acquired the reinforcing quality. The notion of secondary reinforcement is important in Skinner theory of personality. For example, here what they're trying to say, the primary reinforcer may be a food, water, or sometimes maybe sex. But there is a second reinforcer kind of money. Using the money, you can still have what you want, like a food or a water or a pleasure. That's what it tells about the secondary reinforcement. Successive approximation or a shaping part of it. Shaping part of it, it tells about like what you want to desire and what have you achieved out of it. And you try again and again to ensure you get the best out of what you never done it before. That tells about the successive approximation. More complex sorts of behaviors, Skinner had to deal with this. How? The method of successive approximation he explains is in, basically it involves first reinforcing a behavior only vaguely similar to the one desired. Once that is established, you look out for variations that become a little closer to what you want and so on, until you have the organism performing a behavior that would never show up in ordinary life. Skinner and his students have been quite successful in teaching animals to do some quite extraordinary things. Superstitious behavior. We all know about superstitious belief, right? Ravakalam, Yamagandam. All right. So, Nalla Neram. What else? Cat crossing while we are going for some important scenario. Everything being explained in this particular behavior, it has a connectivity to this. So when the reinforcement happens to occur purely due to chance factor, at the time of the individual made a particular response, the individual started to believe that a particular response made by him was the cause for getting the reinforcement, while there was no functional or causal relationship between the response he made and the reinforcements he got. Then members of the primitive tribe, for example, may practice rainmaking by the performance of some ritualized dance. On some occasions, rain does happen to follow the performance. Thus, the rainmaking dance is reinforced and tends to be repeated. The tribal people believe that a causal relationship exists between the dance and the rain. Similarly, take another example, cat crossing the way, which you are all aware of. Another classic example is about Indian society in terms of to appear in your annual examination. When you are on a way, a cat happens to cross the way. If you could not do well in the examination due to one or the other reasons, you started to attribute and blame it on the cat crossing over your way. While in reality, there was no functional relationship between the cat crossing your way and the performance in the examination. The last important one is about an abnormal behavior. The constructs like repressed wishes and identity crisis, conflicts between ego and superego, etc., did not appeal to Skinner for explanation of the abnormal behavior. He advocated that the framework on which his theory is based is sufficient to understand and explain the abnormal behavior. Abnormal behavior is assumed to be the same in its principles of development as normal behavior. In putting forward a program for the treatment of abnormal behavior, Skinner repeatedly asserted that the goal is simply to replace abnormal behavior with normal behavior. We are trying to tell how this particular controlled conditioning or your methodology or your theories is going to address to a person who is behaving abnormally. But what our friend Skinner is saying is that this particular condition been laid so that people will not behave abnormally. So that's what he was trying to counter argue with that. The undesirable behavior can be modified by the manipulation of the environment in a manner determined by the techniques of operant and respondent conditioning. Through these techniques, we can extinguish an undesirable behavior by removing the reinforcer or replace it with a desirable behavior by reinforcement. It has been used on all sorts of psychological problems such as addictions, neurosis, shyness, autism, even schizophrenia. It has been observed that this technique works particularly well with children. The other technique used for behavior modification is a token economy, especially in the jail, primarily in institutions or psychiatric hospitals also. Juvenile halls, certain rules were made explicit in the institution, and behaving appropriately is rewarded with tokens, including poker chips, tickets, funny money, recorded notes, etc. The tokens can be traded in for desirable things such as candy, cigarettes, games, movies, time out of institutions, etc. To give you the short altogether, the Pavlov's, this we are trying to do the evaluation part of it. Pavlov's principles of classical condition were found to be applicable for explaining the development of many psychopathologies. Although Pavlov's theory is able to explain the development and change of a number of aspects of personality, but it is unable to explain the total personality of human beings. Many of his principles are drawn from the experiments conducted on animals. It is also doubtful if these principles can also be applied to human beings. On the other side, Skinner's theory is unable to cover the whole story of personality. According to Noam Chomsky, the concept do not explain fully how a child learns to speak. So now they're also trying to criticize in terms of why the language was not being completely connected altogether. How, for example, do children come up with sentences they have never have heard before? Why the incredibly similarity in language development across cultures? Skinner's theory tends to explain specific behavior changes, but not a comprehensive theory of personality. The word personality itself seems missing from the theory altogether. The role of biological factors has been ignored. Skinner overlooked the individual differences present from birth. In-depth case studies are lacking, partly because comprehensive personality assessment tests have not been developed from the learning perspective. Bowlings in 1984 questioned Skinner's application of principles of animal behavior to the much more complex human behavior. In using animals as substitutes for humans in the explanation of human behavior, Skinner is making big assumptions that general laws relating to the behavior of animals can be applied to describe the complex relations in the human world. So if this assumption proves false, then the entire foundation upon which Skinner's theory test will come crashing down. More experiments with human participants must be done to prove the validity of this. So there's a reason why we kept the distraction altogether in this particular last slide to see how well you are reading or you're getting into that illusion mode altogether. Thank you for your patient hearing. Any questions?
Thanks so much, Shankar.
Thank you.